So our first event today is dedicated to the end of the history to the end of the history. And first, a little remark: we're going to record this event, and I think we're also going to take some photos. So I hope that's okay with all of you. Okay, fine, thanks. And okay, so first the boring stuff. I would like to thank the CH Beck Stiftung, the Kulturreferat, and the Bavarian Ministry of Culture and Science for their generous support of this event. And of course, many thanks to the Monacensia team, especially to Anke Büttner and Sylvie Schlichter, who took care of the event. And I would also like to thank the Café Bar Mona, which is the new cool place in town, which is hosting this event. So this is part of it. And of course, I would very much like to thank our guests. And I'm going, as I said, to introduce them very briefly. We're very happy that you're here. So next to me, we have Alex Hochuli, which I've just learned recently is a Swiss name. And I think we're all free to pronounce you in whatever way. Like. Okay, but I like the Swiss pronunciation. Alex is a writer, researcher, and translator from Sao Paulo, and we're very happy that you're in Europe, and we got a chance to meet you tonight. He's the host of Bangacast and the co-author of the book that we're going to discuss tonight. The book was published with Zero in 2021. Together with George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe. These are the other authors. And there's also a German edition that is published with Promedia in German, das Ende des Endes der Geschichte. I get this confused quite often today. I would also like to say hello to the Austrian editor, Stefan, who's sitting right there. And Stefan was so kind to bring us some books, so please go and buy them after the event. That's the German edition. Then sitting next to Alex is Anton Jäger. He's a historian of political thought. He wrote a dissertation on populism and the democracy of producers in the US, 1877 to 1925. And he's also engaged with public writing, and he published quite a few very interesting articles, which I of course recommend to all of you. And the third person we have sitting here is Bernhard Pirkel, who's also a writer, and he will lead us through the event. Bernhard will be moderating, and again, we're very happy to have you here. Thanks for coming. And just a very short remark on how we are going to organize the event. So we're going to have a discussion with the two authors now, which will probably take about an hour, and after this, we're going to have Q&A, so please make up questions and ask as much as you want. And let's go, the stage is yours.
I think we will have a short break after first hour and then the Q&A. So
okay,
everybody
so you can make up questions
have a smoke.
Nice.
That kind of thing. All right, okay. In 1989, Francis Fukuyama famously proclaimed the end of history. With the collapse of the state socialist model, liberal democracy and the market economy have won the final victory over their greatest opponent, according to Fukuyama. I quote from the end of history: contemporary society came to be seen as a natural order instead of the product of a conflictual historical development. According to the authors of the end of history, this era has come to an end since the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, but at the latest since Brexit, since the election of Trump, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Quote, politics are back, but in strange forms, end of quote. While the period after the end of history was characterized by what Colin Crouch termed post-politics, quote, a form of government that tries to foreclose political contestation by emphasizing consensus, eradicating ideology, and ruling through managerial technocracy. In short, a strategy of depoliticization, end of quote. The authors argue that our current moment is characterized by manifold challenges to the political establishments and the managerial approach to governing society. Quote, anti-politics, by challenging consensus, brings politics back in. For radical emancipatory politics, anti-politics is ambivalent. On the one hand, it wedges open the possibility for a return to popular sovereignty. Quote, politics, in its essence, is division, is a disruption of the normal way of doing things, a fundamental presumption of equality, such that anyone could claim political authority, end of quote. Another quote, but politics is also about representation, the funneling of popular interests, desires, and dreams to agents endowed with the responsibility to translate that will into action, end of quote. And it is in this sense that the authors of The End of History see the various forms of anti-politics lacking. And Alex, if you would kindly just explain to the audience what exactly anti-politics is.
No, I mean, you've said everything, so I can just set this one out.
All right.
It's wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank Bernhard for his introduction, for the invitation, and to Dana, and to everyone here at the Monacensia for hosting us in what is actually a wonderful venue. And thank also to Promedia, our German language publisher. And I should probably offer apologies that the co-authors, Philip and George, aren't here, but you know, that's their loss. So I'm here, you'll have to deal with me. So as Bernhard has already hinted, if our book were to have a kind of big, dumb strapline, like a lot of American publishing has, it'd be politics is back, but it's weirder than ever. Fortunately, we didn't go for anything that stupid. But I think the fact is that to a German audience, I think selling that idea is maybe a little bit more difficult. I hope I don't offend anyone in saying that maybe German politics is a little bit more muted, maybe a little bit more boring, and so the weirdness isn't so present in German politics. But again, when we come to questions, you can say, no, absolutely, I'm wrong. We can come to that. But yeah, so I mean, as Bernhard already explained, the premise of the book is this idea that the Francis Fukuyama period of the end of history has come to an end, which isn't to say that history has restarted, because that would be a radically different claim and a radically bigger claim. Our point is merely that the end of history period is ending, but there hasn't been a systemic alternative to capitalism that has emerged to challenge it. But what is the case is that many of the very basic features of the period from 1990 to 2020, let's just say for those, take that 30-year period, are either gone or are crumbling or withering away. So we can go through a list of these items of what characterizes the end of history. So firstly, you have the forward march of globalization, which has been halted, or in some cases has even gone into retreat. There's this really stupid theory, I don't know if you're familiar with it, that no two countries with the McDonald's would ever go to war with one another. And that obviously is nonsense because of Russia and Ukraine. Though I think Russia has, or McDonald's has withdrawn from Russia, so maybe McDonald's aim is just to prove Putin right, or rather Putin's aim is to prove this stupid theory about McDonald's correct, I don't know. But in any case, there's another element to globalization, or its ideological accompaniment, which would be globalism, and that has also seriously weakened. I think the best way to understand globalism is the way that Tony Blair put it, the former British Prime Minister, who saw globalization as effectively a natural force. To be against globalization is to be against the weather. It's not something that you can actively seek to change. Politicians' job is simply to adapt societies to this whirlwind of change that happens outside. And that radically diminishes the role of the politician in political action. But that is also something which has strongly withered away, especially if you consider the extraordinary policies that have been implemented just in the past 2-3 years. Neoliberalism is another key element of the end of history, and nowadays, if you were to look at neoliberalism in 2022 from the perspective of the 1980s, I think it would be pretty unrecognizable. It's still neoliberalism, but it's really quite radically different, and perhaps we're even moving beyond neoliberalism. And at any rate, the intellectual authority of neoliberalism has completely crumbled. I don't think you find people selling political ideas based on, let's introduce competition as if it were like this grand new idea. I don't think it really has much purchase across Western societies anymore, let alone in the global South. And then finally, this idea of post-politics, which Bern already mentioned, which is this idea that all serious political contestation is foreclosed. That's gone as well. So when we were writing the book in late 2019 and early 2020, these factors seem pretty evident to us, especially observing the scene in the UK, in the US, and certain other countries. But what about Germany then? Because because it's a little bit more of a difficult case, and we tried to incorporate some German examples in the book, but it wasn't always so easy. In my opinion, Germany is trying its hardest to remain in the end of history. The whole political establishment is dedicated to making sure the end of history is perpetuated. And even something like last autumn's election seems to confirm that. So you now have a much more fragmented party system where the two main parties of center-left and center-right no longer account for 80% of the votes. But despite that, you don't really have any serious contest over different ideas and different visions for society. There hasn't been a great populist challenge to have emerged, despite the fears every year around Die Linke or AfD or whatever. Really, these parties just represent different milieus. You have the Green Party style voter and you have the CDU style voter, but it doesn't really represent different interests or different ideologies. So why is Germany stuck in the end of history, seemingly? And I think there's two reasons for this. The first one is probably more obvious, which is that Germany occupies a central role within the capitalist core that has allowed it to insulate itself to a certain extent from the turbulence faced elsewhere in Southern Europe, in the US, and so on. Of course, we'll see with the energy crisis and inflation rising how long that lasts. And the second element, I think, is that Germany, and certainly West Germany, its whole trajectory since the Second World War was already post-historical avant la lettre in a way. It was, certainly as history is conceived as wars and revolution, to put it really simply, West Germany was founded on this idea that we will never have this past again. And the elements of, for example, US strategic supervision or the various constitutional measures that exist in Germany to prevent inflation, these are all ways of locking in politics and making sure that history never arises again. And then you have the EU, which is a major factor, and especially Germany's central role in it. The EU is, above all, the kind of avatar of the end of history. It's a construction whose whole premise is technocratic management and cooperation between national elites, rather than necessarily cooperation between European peoples. So you have this cooperation between elites, which takes the place of democratic representation and popular sovereignty. And then, of course, there's the fact that the EU was always a means of containing any geopolitical ambitions Germany might have. So as a friend of mine, a German friend of mine once put it, Germany is all economy and no politics. Now, I've said all this as a way of kind of undermining the thesis, and you're going, okay, well, why should I buy this book then if you've just, if you've said it's completely not relevant to Germany? But I think there's still a case to be made, and I've already indicated ways in which the end of history might start to crumble in Germany too. But I think we can look across the West, across Europe and North America and beyond, and see that the 2010s, which has been called the populist decade, has come to really replace post-politics, and that anti-politics has emerged as the dominant mode of political contestation. Now, anti-politics, sometimes people use it to mean depoliticization, dropping out, withdrawing from electoral participation, party membership. We see it in a different sense. Anti-politics is more of an angry, active rejection of political establishments. So you can think of anti-corruption protests which have happened across Eastern Europe and different places, across Africa and South America, very presently in Brazil through the mid part of the 2010s. You can think, for example, of the movement of the squares across Southern Europe where they declared, you do not represent us to the political elite. And even the vote for Donald Trump in 2016 with his promise to drain the swamp was also a form of anti-politics, a rejection of the political establishment without rallying behind a new banner, a new attempt to take power and to put something else in its place. So it has a self-defeating element, which means that nothing comes to replace in the place of the rejection. And this anti-politics has even been captured by mainstream politicians. So Emmanuel Macron is probably the perfect example here. He combines elements of the left and the right, but he doesn't represent the old parties. He's no longer part of the old parties. He creates his own party with his own initials as the initials of the party, and he's new, unbeholden to the old political establishment, and therefore he can come in and modernize France. And so here you have a kind of almost a melding of post-politics and anti-politics at the very center of a major European country. So I think what's become clear is that we're now moving into a new phase of the breakdown of the end of history. So we no longer have the placid world of post-politics where citizens withdraw from politics, happy to inhabit this democracy, and democracy in this sense no longer means popular power or representation, but really is this sort of postmodern habitus where we just kind of live our lives in private, go shopping, and nothing ever big ever really happens. So it's very clear, I think, to us that anti-politics replaced post-politics in the 2010s. So what's happening now in the past couple of years? And I'm kind of advancing an argument which isn't contained in the book, but which I think is worth exploring and something Anton and I have discussed before, and we'll carry on this discussion tonight. And it's that politics now seems to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And so you have an excess of political demands, a politicization of intimate life, so that you're having arguments with your aunt over the dinner table about trans rights or who the president of the US is or whatever it is, and it's hugely conflictual and yet somehow meaningless. It doesn't gain any traction, it doesn't lead to the creation of new organizations. So you can think, for example, of how Black Lives Matters protests spread around the world. And people in vastly different countries were adopting the very same slogans they were using in the US, the very same categories they used in the US, irrespective of the fact that they bore absolutely no connection to the realities on the ground in those countries. And Germany actually is probably one of the worst culprits here, I think, in terms of importing a lot of this American politics. Berlin, where I was last night, we were actually discussing this in the bar afterwards. It was the city outside of the US that held the largest Black Lives Matters protest outside the US. Again, with placards in English always denouncing white supremacy or whatever it might be, and not really tangling in any way with the specific contradictions of German society. So, with this sense that politics has interceded into all these areas, and you can think even at an elite level, the way that, for example, something like trans rights, which was previously understood as something that would affect a relatively small number of people who suffer from gender dysphoria, is now the matter of ESG or corporate social responsibility initiatives from major corporations or even NATO. And that then provokes its own opposition, which we now see in the form of these new culture wars that have emerged. And that has seemed to politicize everything. Everybody has an opinion on it. And I think maybe you can think of examples of friends, acquaintances of yours. It's certainly the case for me that I have friends in London where I studied who, until 2014 or something, weren't really political, weren't really interested, and whenever I was talking about politics, they were like, shut up, here's Alex talking about politics again. Now I come back and visit them, and they have opinions on absolutely everything, and feel very strongly about Boris Johnson must be deposed, about the fight against racism needs to be taken on, or that wokes are dominating everything and need to be deposed. Whatever side they take, it's amazing that these people who had no interest in politics are now the most politicized people. And me, kind of, I guess I care a bit about politics, and it's kind of like, would everyone just shut up a little bit, stop talking about politics for a second? But I don't think that the term new culture wars entirely captures what's going on, because there's some very grand political demands that are actually made. So it's not just purely symbolic. There's demands made like stop drilling oil now, everywhere, or abolish the police, which you saw in the United States. So these are quite grand demands, but they have no real way of finding representation, channeling them to political action. So you have this sense of grand claims which meets no real concrete form. Now, I know Anton has proposed this term hyper-politics, and I've told him he's wrong. Because I don't think that's the right term. And so this form of politics now, which is spontaneous, everywhere and nowhere at the same time, breaks the boundaries between high and low, public and private, and is completely disintermediated, is, I think, something that needs a different term. And I think the way to sound really smart, if I've understood this correctly, is to find some term in Greek or Latin and use that, and people go, oh yeah, that's surely serious. And so I'm going to give it a go here. So in ancient Greece, the apeiron was defined as the infinite, the unlimited, or the unbounded. And so according to Anaximander's cosmology, he died in 543 BC, if that's relevant to you. You can look him up. Everything in the world originated from the apeiron, from this boundlessness, rather than from a particular element. The apeiron is undefined and always moving, which is a little bit like our hyper-mediatized politics today. Nothing seems to find concrete form. It's constantly shifting. It's being sped around the world at 100 miles per hour through the internet, but doesn't ever really find any determinate political form or representation. What's interesting is that this notion of the apeiron then gives birth to contradictory terms like hot and cold, wet and dry, and so on. And these oppositions then set into motion their perpetual strife, which I guess maybe seems a little bit like the culture wars we have today. What's interesting is that according to this cosmological vision, this separation causes the world to come into being because things start to take determinate and oppositional form. So maybe that somehow captures where we are, or maybe you think I'm just being pretentious and should drop the idea entirely. We can come to that afterwards. But this unbounded, ever-moving, indeterminate space where political claims proliferate but find a determinate shape, only to cleave off into opposed elements, is precisely like the face-off that you have between liberals and conservatives in the culture wars. So I would propose, instead of hyper-politics, Anton, apeiropolitics. That's not apeiropolitics. That's what happens when we have a drink afterwards. It's not to get confused. Anyway, so the question then, I think, to conclude, is will this moment of hyper-politicization or apeiropolitics bring the world into being? Rather, whether it will succeed in bringing history back, history with a capital H, back into being, into movement. Or what we see is what we're seeing now, really just a further degeneration, the long unwinding of 20th century organized mass politics into a new form of chaotic swirl, which is unable to reckon with the succession of crises and emergencies that we face seemingly permanently in the 2010s, one after the other, 2020s, I should say.
Thank you so much. No, I welcome Alex's, I mean, it's no provocation, it's just an argument about how we should describe what's happening. So I propose the term hyperpolitics more as an hypothesis to clearly capture some contrasts. So people who grew up in the 1990s and the 2000s, who experienced the period, now looking at the world in the 2020s, and I think the example of the friend you gave who until 2014 was completely apolitical and actually castigated you for engaging in political debates, and now has opinions on everything, is an extremely good indicator that at least we've moved out of that world. So something has changed. I don't think we know what has exactly changed, but there's an analytical challenge there, which is very real and which is striking. Now, I've been a friend of the Bunga Boys, as they call themselves for...
We don't call ourselves that, other people call us that.
Well, you know, I have to go with a popular name here. And it's very clear that we share at least the essential diagnosis which is presented in this book, which I think gives an extremely accurate but also extremely intuitive understanding of how the world has changed in the last 30 years. And what is lovely about them is that they're the best versions of left Fukuyamists that are actually around. So a lot of people on the left have an allergic reaction to someone like Fukuyama, partly because of his neoconservative background, partly because he's a sort of old-style modernization theorist. But there's a rational kernel to the thesis he wrote in the 1990s, which is extremely important for the left. And they, I think, offer the most convincing left-wing interpretation of what historical truth Fukuyama was actually expressing in the 1990s. Now, if you look at the 2010s, which is the long sort of breakdown period, there is an almost unending challenge to make sure you don't fall into citations of Gramsci's Interregnum, where you say that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, because it's such a cliched and overdone citation.
The whole book's an effort to avoid that, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's one big exercise in evasion to make sure that you don't have to say this Gramsci statement. And there was a recent conversation on the podcast where I think we were able to capture, or at least I was able to capture, some of the specificities, of what's happening in the 2020s. And if you look at the long post-history period that runs from the early 1990s to the early 2020s, you can maybe see it as a patient that has gone into a comatose state and that is not even conscious, as there's no sense of agency to the patient as such. Now, what happens in the 2010s is that the machines start bleeping, there's all kind of doctors around the bed or starting to have a look at what's happening to the patient, and then at one point the patient does wake up. Suddenly there is a pang of consciousness that enters there, but the patient still can't move. So the comatose state has ended, but there's an immobilism or there's a kind of paralysis, which is very, very deep and which is very difficult to overcome. And I think this captures quite well just what we're trying to describe with hyperpolitics or apeiropolitics, where it is clear that something has ended. So all of the recipes and all of the modes of public engagement, which were very prevalent in the 90s and the 2000s, so post-politics, neoliberalism, those strategies of depoliticization, a radical privatization of politics as well, where people didn't actually feel comfortable not having debates, but not speaking about who they were voting for, which is a striking thing if you come out of a 20th century mass politics world where if someone was a socialist in Belgium or someone was a Christian Democrat in Belgium, you'd go to a Christian school, you'd read a socialist newspaper, or you'd even go to socialist cafes. So the boundaries between public and private when it came to politics were extremely porous. And in the 1990s and 2000s, this completely disappears. Now, if we look at the world now in the 2020s, and this is what the hyper-politics concept is trying to capture, it's clear that that doesn't hold anymore. Politics has re-entered the private sphere. This rigid separation between public and private has been sublated. But of course, strangely enough, and this is the historical confusion we're experiencing, that has not implied a reversion or a return to the modes of mass politics we know from the 20th century. So we're looking at a creature that is familiar insofar as it shows continuity with some of the post-historical forms you discussed, but which doesn't look like anything that we know from the vocabulary of 20th century political science. So the parties we look at are extremely fleeting, startup and pop-up parties. They don't have distinct rules as to who is a member and who's a non-member. With the Black BLM protests also in the United States, it's a very clear example that these were the biggest protests in numerical terms in American history. Never in the history of the United States had so many people been on the street for such a sustained period of time. Now, of course, what this led to in the end of 2020 was a decrease in the budget for certain police forces, and in the end, the actual trial of a police officer, which was a new historical point. If we look 2 years later, we see that all of the police departments in question, which lost their funding at the time, have now regained it, part as a response to a new crime wave. And this, I think, again, captures the paradoxical nature of the new type of hyperpolitics we're trying to describe, where you have intense political energy, enormous polarization, contestation, and enormously ground demands about abolishing the police, about paying reparations, about completely restructuring the entirety of the American state. And then 2 years later, it is a group of people went to a party continuously for 2 months, clamored for certain changes, and now it's not clear who actually participated in the protest and what kind of institutional legacy the protests have left behind. I think this is the central metaphor I want to use, where the comatose state of our patient has ended. They're looking at the world, they're experiencing things, but there is no capacity for agency and there's no capacity for political action like you had in the 20th century. Now, the reason I use the word hyperpolitics mainly in a more technical sense is that what you also see in the 1990s is a separation of what we call politics and policy. So politics are processes of popular will formation and representation, the ones that Alex also describes in the book. It's how people get together and actually form collectivities as such, while policy is about the execution or the enacting of that popular will, mainly on a state level or an institutional level. And what you have in the 1990s is a rigid separation between those two moments. So politics is relegated to the private sphere or to a media sphere that's eternally addicted to novelty, while policy is essentially delegated to managerial technocracies or to unelected power in central banks. Now, what we're seeing in the 2010s, 2020s is that this separation between politics and policy has not really come to an end. So it's not as if the moment of politics or of will formation and the moment of the enactment or the execution of that will have come back together. But there is an intensification on one side of the dichotomy where politics, as the generation of collectivities, does tend to escalate much further and tends to move out of the private sphere, as it was in the 2010s. So this is the hypothesis I'm trying to present. I'm not sure we need the word hyperpolitics for it. Maybe we'll find better terms for it. But we need to find a way of seeing a world that is definitely changing, that has moved out of a neoliberal consensus, however incoherently, that has moved out of a certain post-historical phase. But again, the end of history does sadly not imply the restarting or a new begin of history itself. And I myself have used this slogan where I caution people it might take a while before history starts again, or maybe the decline of the American empire will drag us all down into the abyss anyway. But this is the hybrid situation we're trying to describe. This is all extremely speculative, so anyone in the room or Alex himself who has other intuitions on this is very much welcome to give further comments. Thank you.
I think, firstly, to kind of make a rather small, concrete point, but you could argue that with regard to the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, that it actually did have a concrete institutional consequence, which was to channel all these voters who might have previously been voters for Bernie Sanders or some type of anarchist or whatever, into the Democratic Party. And in fact, that's one of the ironies, I think, of the moment, which is that the defeat of left populism, and I think we can pretty much clearly bookend left populism from 2015 to 2019, is that looking back, for all the excitement around it, what its main effect was to channel back into the main establishment parties and try to re-energize them or in some way re-legitimate parties which were at the risk of really falling apart or becoming hollow shells. And it's very clear with the Labour Party in Britain, with the Democratic Party in the US, and Podemos in Spain as well, which is now just basically supporting the kind of main neoliberal Spanish Socialist Party. So I think that is perhaps an argument, or rather to kind of tease out what the implications of that would be. It's that is perhaps a way, an attempt to clamp down on the emergence of politics properly and to return to post-politics. Which again poses problems for the argument I'm trying to make about the end of history, because there's always forces which are trying to contain it again. And I started off talking about Germany and this perpetual attempt to contain the outbreak of politics. And so there are factors which, there were moments during the pandemic, I think, even when we had arguments on the podcast, and I remember George, my co-host, making the argument like, no, it's all over, it's all gone back, it's all been put back in the box, everyone's at home, demobilized, so all the political energies that had existed in the 2010s have now gone back in the box. Now, I think to look on the bright side, things are getting worse. So the turbulence that exists means that I don't think that it will congeal again into this end of history formation. And certainly you wouldn't have the positive endorsement of, for example, consumerism that you had in the 1990s as an avenue for people's energy, their libidinal energy, not least because that was underpinned by a huge amount of private credit, which now isn't available. And rising cost of living will also challenge that. And I think it's important to think about this looking prospectively, and to try to be optimistic through the pessimism. Which is that we haven't dealt with, I think probably a few of us in this room, and probably for 2 generations, dealt with serious inflation. And that's a major political factor which we've even forgotten, and politicians in many cases aren't adjusted to having to deal with that. And the real sovereigns today are central banks, as Anton already hinted at. And their whole goal through the neoliberal period was to tame inflation, and they succeeded, and they won in part by breaking the back of the working class, which meant that there was no longer upward pressure on wages, and now they're kind of ruling over this void, and don't have the mechanisms anymore to counter inflation, because one measure which you would traditionally do would be to raise interest rates. But if the problem is high oil prices, high commodity prices, supply shortages, raising interest rates will just put a further dampener on the economy, and so won't promote any sort of growth whatsoever. So they're in a real bind there. And I don't think they're necessarily accustomed to thinking creatively about how to deal with it, even if it's things which wouldn't be in the interest of the working class. I think even then they don't have any creative solutions. The other thing I think, just briefly on the separation between politics and policy, I think that's well put. What I think is interesting about the hyper-politicization today, and I'm using your term again, is that whereas traditionally one would understand policy as being in some ways subordinate to politics, that political will would be formed and then policies would then be kind of extracted or traced out from that. So you might have a political will for a more egalitarian society, and then you have policies which might be redistributive, which ensue from that. After the separation, and now that they've come back together, I think you have an odd situation where you have politics, but politics is subordinate to policy. So you still have policy being made in technocratic organizations, quangos, regulatory agencies, central banks above all, but you have a whole lot of politics, a whole lot of shouting, effectively, going on underneath that, but which finds it intractable to really gain a grasp over policy. And in fact, it's almost like in some of these grand demands, an unwillingness even to broach policy, to tangle with policy, because the demands almost exceed the possibility for policy to even deal with it. Like, for example, stop drilling for all oil. Well, that's not going to happen. Or in any case, would be so damaging economically in the immediate term as to be impossible. And so there's this weird disconnect that happens with policy still kind of the wheels of policy still turning on, still turning, crisis fighting, while everyone else is kind of shouting at each other in somewhat futile fashion.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have 3 or 4 broad points in response, which again vindicate everything you said in your analysis. So I think one of the symptoms which clearly speaks in favor of our hypothesis is that what you saw already in the late 2010s is what you could describe as a clear nostalgia for post-history, certainly parts of professional classes in the West, but also in the rest of the world. So the people who were most at ease with the specific settlement that was instituted in the 1990s experienced the disappearance, or at least the fracturing of that settlement, as a trauma. So the fact that you had clear annotations of people dreaming back to the Olympics or dreaming back to Tony Blair's 1990s, this clearly shows that they're expressing a grievance over something that is no longer coherently there. So that very speaks in favor of the idea that we're in post-history. It's just not clear that anything resembling history is actually started. The second point about inflation is a similar thing, insofar as inflation is the expression of a certain class dynamic. So throughout the 20th century, most forms of inflation have a very close connection to institutionalized or non-institutionalized forms of class conflict. They're about specific organized actors such as the working class making claims on the state and also making claims on other social actors. This generates an inflation dynamic, and inflation in that sense is almost an indirect expression of history, because if you have these organized interests facing each other, and if class struggle is the motor of history, well, if you see inflation, then the motor is working. What we now have is an inflationary world in which the working class as a cohesive social agent does no longer exist. And this is why the Financial Times yesterday just said, the inflation we're seeing now has nothing to do with a wage price spiral or any of this stuff, and most of the costs of this inflation will exclusively be borne by workers because they have no bargaining power whatsoever. And this is an extremely, almost historically unprecedented situation, insofar as all of the forms of inflation we're familiar with from the 20th century did have that contributing factor in wage demands made on behalf of the working class. Now we have an inflationary world that is intensely destabilizing, but which the working class as a concerted social actor no longer exists. And again, this is a sign of the kind of hybrid situation we're in. So what does it mean to have an inflation without an organized working class? Well, we need to invent a term for this, because otherwise we won't be able to make sense of it. The other thing which ties into the nostalgia for post-history is the return of a specific type of nationalism or a sacrificial ethic in parts of the liberal elite. So the remilitarization of Europe that's currently being discussed, the idea that Germany could reintroduce something like the draft, the fact that there's all kinds of martial rhetoric with certain intellectuals and groups who were very much by default pacifist in the 1990s and the 2000s. This shows at least that there's a certain spirit of sacrifice or a certain departure from the hedonism which was so omnipresent at the time, which again points at a hybrid situation, because I cannot imagine Germany reintroducing a draft and loads of German youngsters signing up as if it's 1914. As John Mersheimer always says, you've never visited a German disco if you think that's going to happen. But this is, again, a sign of the hybrid situation when we're in. Inflation without an organized working class, patriotism without actual mass military mobilization, and again, nostalgia for a period that is itself the end of history. These all speak in favor of your hypothesis. The question is, what term should we be using to describe these situations?
Yeah. I just want to respond to that really quickly, and then maybe, I don't know if Bernard wants to come in. The question of militarization and the kind of mobilization that implies, I think is something that elites have a difficult time entangling with. Because of course, COVID and the state responses to COVID, specifically the lockdown, which was something which was imitated from China, despite the fact that the WHO said such measures should never be adopted. Suddenly they adopted them once China introduced them. And that was effectively a mass demobilization of society, of the type that has never been seen before, other than perhaps in wartime, except that in wartime you have actually mass mobilization because men are sent off to fight. So it's a kind of historically unique situation in which it would make sense. And I don't want to be conspiratorial here, so I'm not saying that, you know, the lockdowns were a measure to clamp down on the kind of populist moment which was arising. But it was very convenient for elites that lockdowns showed themselves up as a potential policy because it did clamp down on all politics and made forced a return effectively to technocracy. Politicians could hide behind experts. There was no politics other than COVID politics. There was only one discussion, and in fact there wasn't really even any discussion because opposition to it was really not really accepted, and the only opposition to these COVID policies tended to be from far right or various conspiratorial groups, anti-vaxxers and so on, which I think actually the mainstream media was all too happy to amplify as a way to...
alternative plan.
Exactly. Well, as well, yeah, they had no alternative plan, and just to show, look, anybody who opposes this is obviously this crazy person, rather than having a serious debate, for example, about state capacity, lack of hospital beds, new creative solutions which could have been made to deal with the pandemic instead of simply shutting everyone at home for a year and a half. But where's the tangle there? Well, I think the problem is that with something like militarization and introducing the draft, that inherently suggests a more public form of politics in which it brings people into politics. And that's always a dangerous thing, to have masses of people together. And I think that is going to be a real challenge for elites if they're thinking of doing that, where you're basically doing this push and pull, like, yes, come out a bit more, no, not too much. And actually, there was a version of this in more muted form in the transition from the end of history to the end of history, which was, as we say in the book, through the 1990s and 2000s, politicians were desperate for people to engage in politics. There were all these get out the vote campaigns, just come out and vote, it doesn't matter who for. We just need, hey, someone please listen to us, kind of infuse our states with some form of legitimacy by actually participating in elections. Suddenly people start voting and they vote the wrong way, and then people are like, actually don't vote, actually, you can stay home. And I think that dynamic is already, it captures very well what we might now be seeing with what you referred to in terms of mobilization and demobilization.
Do you have anything to add?
I have nothing to add to that, but I would like you, Alex, to tell us something about the affective and psychopolitical dynamics you described in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe let's just maybe talk about NOPS a little bit.
Yeah.
Neoliberal order breakdown syndrome.
Yeah.
Just in my opinion, it's just one of the most useful analytical tools you develop in the book.
Yeah, no, so I think we've already hinted at this idea of the kind of liberal establishment, reacting hysterically, effectively to any form of political challenge. And I'm going to make myself maybe probably unpopular in the German audience, but it's when I tell friends in Brazil that in Britain there was a referendum to leave the EU and one side won and then the other side refused to accept the result, it's like, that's completely outrageous. How could they do that? No, I mean, but that's just a coup, And I think in Europe, there were a lot of mainstream Europe, it was like, well, absolutely, it's the wrong idea to leave the EU. People voted against their own interests. They're stupid or racist or whatever, and the result of the referendum has to be overturned. So at least from kind of friends on the Brazilian left, they were completely outraged by this. They might not have thought it's a good idea for Britain to leave the EU or not really have much of an opinion. But anyway, I think it's so normalized, this idea that things are changing and they need to be put a lid on, that we had to find a way to describe a whole set of symptoms which were not just, for example, what is called in the US Trump derangement syndrome, which is very obvious, or Brexit derangement syndrome, but a set of responses across the effectively liberal establishments and a lot of their supporters within the professional and managerial classes of, as we put it, an inability to accept, explain, and respond to political change and to political challenge. And this takes various forms. So Anton already mentioned the nostalgia the nostalgia for a recent past, which, for example, you might have some left liberal type who never really liked, was critical of Obama, thought that, he started too many wars or whatever it might be, or didn't live up to his promise, thought he might be more, redistributive and wasn't, and then suddenly Trump comes along and Obama becomes reconstituted as this glorious figure, America's greatest ever president on par with Lincoln or whatever it might be. And there's a whole set of these kind of psychopolitical responses, which you don't have to, be in favor of some of the populist challenges to understand that, there was no attempt at understanding. So there was no sense that the liberal establishment could account for its own actions, which might have led to the situation that has emerged. So you have globalization was continually pushed, which will, rising tide, which will lift all boats. There are people who end up left behind, and growing regional inequalities, growing income inequalities, and then they turn around and say, well, these people are voting for protest parties, it must be because they're racist, rather than in any way understanding that the very people who were in charge were responsible for creating the world that we live in. They somehow write themselves out of the story, and there's always, I think, that kind of this bizarre thing where a lot of the liberal establishment tries to see itself as a minority, as somehow their backs to the wall, honest people who are just trying their best, faced against a right wing which is vicious and power hungry and whatever, ignoring the fact that they actually are culturally hegemonic and often in actual power and are a party of government, as is the case with the US Democrats. So I think that's
Conspiratorial angle.
and the conspiratorial angle as well, right? So then the other ways that they reach for means to explain what is going on, again, writing themselves out of the story, is conspiracy, right? So the only way people could have voted for Brexit or for Trump, for example, to take the kind of classic examples of the end of history, is because Putin somehow wormed his way into their brains with bots and convinced them to vote against their own interests. And so things which were previously understood, conspiracy theories, are traditionally understood as a way for outsiders to make sense of the world by attributing agency to some powerful agent up there, a powerful cabal that controls everything. Really, conspiracy theories are a form of agency panic, a sense of your own lack of agency, and then you project that your own sense of lack of agency in negative form to something else, which is seen to be the super agent, which is able to control everything. Except now it's the very people at the very centers of power, the insiders par excellence, who are proliferating conspiracy theories as a way to explain the fact that they have lost legitimacy and that they don't have much support. And I think that's just an absolutely crazy situation. And it's to a certain extent even been normalized. And so this sort of hysteria, I think the establishment tries to portray irrational, hysterical politics as something that emerges from the masses, because the masses are irresponsible, they don't know their own interests, they're probably racist, fascist, whatever else it might be, when in fact, to the extent that some sort of irrational attitudes are displayed in politics, it's merely a reflection of something that the elites have started, and they've kind of instantiated and initiated this form of hysterical politics.
Okay, we have another 30 minutes for Q&A, and please feel also free to ask in German. Perfectly fine. Both speakers sort of understand German. If not, we're going to help with the translation. And we're very excited to hear your questions. And I think Bern is going to collect them.
Sure.
And
Show of hands, please.
in German, English, or Greek.
Not in Greek.
If you have questions, you can start.
Oh yeah.
In this kinds of discussions, I always circle back around to the same question, kind of. Obviously, politics is kind of not the starting, but it's the end of the end, sure. But it's with new subjectivity. It's with a subjectivity that's neoliberalized, to use this vague term. And it's also neoliberal identities on which it's based. So before there were identities or communities already in the world, like the workers' movement, which kind of formed an identity, but which try to supersede itself. Is that right? Okay-ish in English? But these new kinds of identities, they don't try to supersede themselves. So, is it possible that in this moment there can be a reproduction of another non-neoliberal identity?
That's a good question. I think there was another question. Oh yeah, back there.
Answer first, or we collect?
We're collecting.
Yeah.
We're collecting a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, first, thank you very much for your intriguing analysis. I really like it, especially the idea of hyper-politics or the apéron of polis. Yeah, this could be a big field of discussion. But my question leads a bit in this direction, less in the question of identity, but rather in the question of the creation of a subject, a political subject. How does this idea start, and in how far does this question lead us to an idea of, okay, how is a subject created as a epistemological or political entity, an identity? So the first question. The other question would be, well, the analysis is, as I said, very intriguing, but yeah, so what now at the end of the end? Is there something like an imperative or a surplus of this analysis that gives us an idea and not a political program, but the epistemological surplus maybe, going back to this idea of the creation of the subject. Can you take something out of this analysis that gives maybe an idea of solution sounding too programmatic, but something that's hope is also not the right concept, but yeah, maybe you can see what I mean.
Yeah, I think also going a bit in the same direction. Like the speaker said, there seems to be a surge in this kind of politic of recognition, as one says, and then the question, recognition of a subject by other subjects, and then the question is always recognized by whom. And I think the key term for me in your discussion was political agency, and I think that is one of the actual key or problematic terms, because in this culture wars that you described, or in this discussion that are not about even material change or policy, direct policy changes, there often seems to be a master that the discourse addresses. I mean, this is famous speech of Lacan, in which a French student comes up and tries to politicize the audience, and Lacan kind of dismisses him by saying, "What you seek is a new master." And I think one of the key questions would be, why are people seeking a new master? And it seems to be around every cultural discussion that there seems to be someone to address, so that this addressed subject or entity may push down this or this policy road and do the things the clientele wants. So it is a task of a re-emerging political agency to get free of this addressing a master.
Yeah.
And then we have another question over there.
Ja, vielen Dank für den Vortrag, und ich fand es sehr schön, als ich auch das Buch gelesen habe, die Idee, das Ende der Geschichte zu historisieren. Aber zugleich habe ich mir dann die Frage gestellt, was eigentlich der Rahmen, also die Historisierung, natürlich, was eigentlich den Rahmen dann zusammenhält. Und da wäre meine Frage, ob man nicht da noch stärker die politische Ökonomie rausarbeiten müsste, die die Politik begleitet, weil ich glaube, dass da eben so eine strukturelle Kausalität
question was, or was rather more of a comment, right? Or just a desideratum. The comment was that he applauded the task of historicization of the end of history, but there's a lack of connection with the political economy which happened in exactly that period. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, like that was like one point, like when you have a frame of historicization, that the frame of the historization, in my opinion, should be the political economy, which determines the politics, and then you can, like, the politics is an expression out of these conflicts which are behind and which are not, which you don't see that obviously, because like it's the same point when you have like the demonstrations against the technocracy. You don't see the process building of the technocracy. So, and behind that there are interests which are also not that obvious. So that was the point which I think the aspect of the political economy should probably be more emphasized.
You go first.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, there's three questions, I guess, which related to subjectivity. So I'll try to respond to that. First of all, I'm slightly skeptical of those takes which see somehow that we're in some intractable situation of individualization and atomization, where that effectively the type of subjectivity we have today makes politics impossible. I think ultimately there is a turn towards individual solutions and a demoralization that happens, which is a rational response to the lack of alternatives. Now, of course, there's a lot of cynicism there as well, so that it's not simply a matter of turning up and making big promises that, hey, let's have a revolution, or, we'll double your wages, or whatever it might be, because there's a real credibility gap there in terms of being able to make political promises and be believed. And that's also, in a way, a rational response because of the succession of disappointments that citizens have faced over the past 30, 40 years. And I think, one element, I guess, of what would be called neoliberal subjectivity, which I think is a little bit more difficult to tangle with, is this notion that, and it's a contradictory one, that autonomy is in some ways greatly prized today. And we can see this in the world of work. People increasingly want to be their own boss, be an entrepreneur. The classic neoliberal formulation of being an entrepreneur of the self. I think this is clear not just on social media, but preferring perhaps to be an Uber driver than something else because, hey, I can set my own hours. I know it's terrible pay. I know I have to work for 12 hours a day, but somehow there's still an appeal there. And I think one can see that manifest in politics too, where the desire for spontaneous pop-up politics, where there's very low cost of entry and no cost to exit, is also there. And the idea of commitment is pretty anathema to a lot of people, because you don't want to have to be paying, dues to the party of X amount per month, and then be stuck in a party where you disagree with people and you find that I'd rather just drop out rather than try to win people over. And I think that is really intractable, and I think that's very difficult. There's a positive side to it, which is that desire for autonomy, perhaps, does speak to a desire for freedom. But it seems to only manifest itself today in a desire to drop out, whether it's to drop out of the labor market or to drop out of formal forms of employment in large companies of whatever it might be, in which you can form both bonds of solidarity with your fellow workers, or indeed politically as well. So there's a sort of anti-hierarchical bias, and here's the contradiction, because I think we live in incredibly democratic times in which any claim to authority, any claim to dominance or to some inherited form of hierarchy or whatever it might be, are rejected outright. I don't, there's only a very small body of the population which are quite reactionary, which would accept that, which looks to, to actually, no, I want a real master to dominate me. That's still, maybe 20% at the most of most Western societies. And so this great democratic spirit, which I think is in some ways a product of neoliberalism, but is anyway, it can be seen in terms of, some actual progress that has been achieved, sits somehow in contradiction with the possibility to actually forge larger bodies of people democratically acting together. And I don't have a clear answer to that, but I think, to try to find the element of, the sort of positive element in that is that desire for autonomy that people have. And so I think a lot of left-wing politics tries to return to the post-war settlement, to return to Keynesian Fordism, to have greater redistribution. And again, that encounters the problem that the credibility problem, that it's basically politicians coming along and saying, hey, we're going to give you something. And maybe people don't want to be given something. I don't know. I mean, this is speculative. But I think what there is a desire for autonomy, for self-determination. And so I think this is a moment, at least, for the possibility of saying, whether it's claims for popular sovereignty, for different forms of autonomy to not be constantly regulated by the state, for example, that it perhaps does present an avenue for progressive or radical politics. Which is perhaps underexplored by the left because it tends to rely back on redistribution effectively, which seems to not have many buyers. And I think so. To kind of conclude that thought, the need for recognition by the big other somehow, or this master, which is a facet of identity politics, undoubtedly, and it's all forms of identity. It seems like the main political question today is not where are we going, but who are we? And following on from who are we, it is we are here. Please recognize me. We're here. And I think it's even clear. I think in some forms of, I think even some of the working class vote for Trump took that form as well. Hey, we're here. Don't forget about us, and we can piss you off. We can, poke you in the eye. We still have some form of leverage, some form of power. But it still remains trapped in the logic of identity, not of a transcendence of the subject, to form a new collective subject, but really, I am what I am here, please recognize me. And that's very tricky. Maybe Anton has a solution to it.
No, what I'm going to say is completely complementary to what Alex has said, so I'm just trying to tie together all the questions. So I think if you read the book, and certainly some of the other things the authors have written, the way they historicize post-history, the way they historicize the passage into post-history, is very much a materialist explanation, or at least there's not a sort of most coherent theory, but at least they hint at this. There are drivers within the political economy, mainly of the 1970s and 1980s, which now a really rich literature exists about, whereas precisely the working class, or the last stand of the working class at the time, which is a driver of inflation, which faces a capitalism that is stagnating, in which growth rates are plummeting, and then the only solution to stabilize capitalism is break the backbone of this class actor, and that's what really leads to the post-historical period. So post-history is not the sort of metaphysical process that produces itself. It's a very concrete political struggle which takes place around the 1970s, 1980s, which is about the making of promises, both in the East and the West, and it's precisely because capital reasserts its dominance not over investment but over society and wins that battle, that post-history is built on a working class that doesn't die, but that is killed, like actively.
Yeah.
So I think it is an active political process which has structural drivers, insofar as you can only understand the passage to post-history through this political economy angle, because otherwise you just end up with pseudo-Hegelian metaphysics.
Yeah, and to just take that thought on, or to extend it into, further into time, is that, elites rule over a void once the working class is defeated, its organizations are completely hollowed out, and the basis of legitimacy then, one, is no longer so much under threat during the end of history, and two, is extended primarily through debt, so the idea of buying time constantly. And that's what's underpinned the legitimacy. And this is why I return to the question of inflation now and to rising cost of living, because those tools now aren't there anymore. And that's what will, especially if, the conception of the citizen is really one of being a consumer through the end of history. Well, if that consumer can no longer consume in the way that they were able to, whether through rising wages, which now hasn't been the case for 40 years, or through rising private debt, then where does it go? And then if prices are rising, that really does create a shock. So I think, I don't want to be catastrophist or to say that suddenly things are going to get worse and the workers will suddenly rise up, which is the sort of standard left response and tends not to be historically the case. In fact, uprisings tend to happen when there's rising expectations, which are then confounded. And we obviously know this whole period has not featured rising expectations. Anyway, so I don't want to do that kind of standard lefty answer, but I do think it's something very serious to grapple with, and that we're not entirely intellectually prepared for what might happen.
And just to add, if you read the structural drivers of post-history as originating in those imperatives that come out of political economy, you can also tell a different story about the individualization we're talking about, less as a sort of individual pathology, and that people can't escape this neoliberal subjectivity in a hegemonic sense, or because they've been manipulated into thinking about their issues individually. It's just because we live in an era of such spectacularly lopsided class power, as Adam Tooze says it, because capital's reign is so unlimited in many ways. This leads to a mentality of resignation, and resignation leads to individualization. So whether you're going to buy crypto or you're just going to speculate on the labor market, it's a rational risk calculus you're making as you're facing insanely difficult odds on the labor market that's completely arranged and organized in the favor of capital. And if people still have a desire for autonomy and agency, which is very obvious, the only avenues are either to become a sort of speculator or a rentier yourself, or there are other forms of identities that then become available. Some of them are minoritarian, so you decide to identify with a minority group which has certain historical wrongs inflicted on them, and in a paternal way you then appeal to a master to say, since we experienced this historical wrong, we deserve reparations or we do this. Or there's a majoritarian strategy, which is just the people, which is exactly the populist period we're describing, where the implicit subject of every capitalist democracy since the 19th century has been the people. What happens in the 20th century is that the people become sociologically more concrete in something like party democracy, where the socialists have their own version of the people, the Christian Democrats have their own version of the people, the liberals do. But once on this challenge of the 1970s, you wipe away party democracy as a mediator, the people is the only subject left, or some of these minority subjects. And then the story should be, what kind of proposal or what kind of organizational plan is there to convince people of your risk calculus and say, you want autonomy, here's a different way of getting it that doesn't involve buying crypto, going on the internet and signing a petition, shitposting on Facebook, or if you're a politician now, marching in climate marches against climate change, when people are like, but you're a politician, you're in charge, so what are you doing at the climate march? If you're actually making the policy for the green transition. This is like an application of agency that's spectacular.
And it's an abdication of authority, which is, I think, what is fundamental here. And to return to your question, I think fundamental political task today, and it's easy to put in abstract terms, far more difficult to put it into concrete form, but it's to reconstitute authority and to be willing ourselves to claim authority for ourselves, which has almost been sort of taboo, and it's been taboo in part because elites themselves wash their hands of their own authority. And I think the example that Anton gives is perfect. These people are in charge, supposedly, right? And then go petitioning some other to take action.
Who are you appealing to? Who are you addressing?
Yeah. Look in the mirror, literally. And so I think that need to reconstitute authority, at least we should be hopeful in one element of it, which is, and to return to the question and to tie that together with the question of commitment, because I think there is, at the same time as this desire for autonomy, which often resolves itself into individualistic solutions, a desire for a social project. People feel quite intimately, I think you would all agree, a lack of social purpose, the sense of drift, a kind of lack of real meaning to life. And when there is a moment, and this is why emergency politics has such an appeal, which is, I think, a problematic development, but I think it does shed a light on something. Emergency politics engages us all and demands some new form of action. And it's why so many people went along with COVID lockdowns, for example, and a lot of the compliance there, even if it sometimes didn't make a lot of sense, or you weren't sure of the purpose of it, or it was contrary even to your own interests or desire to be out and socialize with friends, is because it felt like a common project. And I think there is a genuine desire for that, and that hasn't yet found a proper outlet. But I think that's something that we can take some heart from.
And I think left populism also showcases this, like despite its faults and despite the fact that it was for able to actually consolidate its power, left populism at least gave us a sense that there's an appetite for something radical among interesting sections of the population, where like, wow, people are willing to take a gamble, they're willing to vote on candidates which were considered completely beyond the pale a couple of 10 years ago. And that actually shows that there is an appetite for autonomy which is worth taking seriously, which shouldn't be denigrated. It's just, what kind of calculus are people making when they express this desire of autonomy? And unfortunately, given the way society is organized now, it can mostly only organize itself, or express itself rather, in the safest way on an individual level.
Do we have more questions?
Another round of questions, sorry.
Klar.
Ja? Aber bitte laut. Und nicht zu lang, bitte.
Wenn allen eigentlich klar ist, wahrscheinlich in der Form, dass die politische Macht nicht mehr die ist, die wir wählen können, die sind, die wirklich in Charge sind, dann könnte man ja einfach die Macht des Konsumers nutzen, um die Unternehmen dazu bringen, also die Lobby benutzen, dazu, die Unternehmen dazu zu bringen, seine politischen Ziele zu erfüllen. Ich meine, die Top 10 Unternehmen heute sind ja alles Unternehmen, die keine Sachen produzieren, die irgendeinen Sinn haben für die Menschen. YouTube, Facebook und so weiter sind ja extrem leicht eigentlich zu beschreiben, wenn alle Konsumer sich vereinigen würden und sagen würden, wir würden uns boykottieren, also kannst du politische Forderungen quasi an die Firma stellen. Sagen,
So, yeah, you summarize it.
All right, yeah. The question is, why don't we deal with this impasse of having no access to real power by organizing as ethical consumers?
we can say free a source, not to the government, just say Facebook and boycott Facebook. And there was a big movement, all of it. Boycott Facebook, just for a month, they go down.
Which is probably, to which Alex probably would say, read a book about the end of history era, right?
Maybe it's a-
Which is
yeah, you
because
go ahead.
because
No, yeah,
that's
yeah.
Just a
precisely
question,
what.
yeah.
I mean, I have a kind of, you know, I hate the term ethical consumption, and I hate ethical consumption. So I should say that for starters. But if you can maybe reconceptualize in a different way, I think it's possible for there to be, in some senses, you know, some form of consumer collectivity, which acts as a real sort of economic agent to fight for lower energy prices, for example, which might be something, and then develops into something which might develop into demand for build out of nuclear power, which, hey, Germany, that would be a good idea, by the way. You know, you don't have to import gas or burn a bunch of coal instead. So, you know, nuclear power is a good solution. But in terms of phrasing it in ethical terms, I think is deeply problematic. Not least because that is the ruling ideology. You know,
The question was also about doing it individually.
Right.
So, like consumer activism on an individual level that then aggregates itself into something.
But I think then that precisely lacks the moment in which social bonds are created and people meet face to face. So they might individually might be capable of exercising some leverage through a consumer cooperative, but without it being a collective movement, it doesn't lead to the development of a collective subject or change that subject themselves. It's still you at home wanting your Amazon delivery to come faster or whatever it might be, right? Or Facebook maybe not to steal your data. But the problem with ethical consumption, there's a great terrible example which I read the other day, which was something called like No Evil Foods, which is an American company which sells vegan foods, right? And this is just a great example of what ethics now means, right? They told their employees, don't listen to these old white guys who are trying to unionize the company because they're probably all racist, right? You don't want to listen to these old white guys. And actually, if you did join a union, you'd be like those type of people. And what would happen is that would really run against everything that we're trying to do here and trying to be an ethical company that cares for the planet and cares for people and blah, 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 blah. So if there was any doubt in the 1990s and 2000s when there was a lot of talk about ethical consumerism, today we should be under no doubt it is a weapon used by the ruling class against the working class. So I don't think we can shy away from that truth anymore.
Yeah, I just want to add that we don't have to deny that there are certain avenues for agency which lie within this approach. So this, like scholar Michel Fer had written a book about like weaponizing your power as a debtor, or for example, rent strikes is another example.
Yeah.
So not exercising agency qua workers, but looking at some of these new structural positions which are there in the economy and actually using them. The issue is, to me, always one of discipline. So what is specific about, to me, politics is just discipline. I don't think it is anything else. And what kind of discipline is possible within that type of context? And I think something like cancel culture, or the way the online world works, shows that you can exercise a certain form of collective power online, but what is most suitable for is just the policing and the exclusion of people within your social sphere. That's what it mostly does, partly also because the margin of success is so much higher for some of these other challenges. So if you actually want to change like investment patterns in the coal industry, or even in climate matters in general, individual consumer decisions have a very, very limited reach. So, and then the question becomes, so they're already asking you to tone down or tell your teenagers to not have showers to save Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. And it's very clear that this does not hurt Putin at all in any way, and the limits are just extremely palpable. There's one specific point from the left which I think should always be taken into account, and this is the point Friedrich Engels made time and time again, where he said there is a de facto asymmetry between the working class and capital within a capitalist society, insofar as capitalist society by default favors capital, because it's a society which is ordered to its needs. So he always said capital is already organized, and it doesn't need that much organization to get what it wants. The employing class can unite itself in certain organizations to push demands, but it has enough structural power of society to make what happens. In the case of an individualized labor force, that's not at all the case. You don't have that type of structural power because you're just not in the same position. And that means the disciplinary boundary you have to cross is much, much higher, and this makes it far more difficult to actually get what you want, unlike your antagonist in this fight.
We have 2 more questions.
Mine will be the last one.
You want to do the last one?
Yeah.
Martin?
I have a question about what role you would ascribe to theory, because I mean, if you're talking about a subject and you're talking about the working class, for Marx and for a Marxist tradition, it was completely clear from the beginning that the working class is not just something that is out there, but it's also a theoretical construct that you have to construct through the analysis of the categories that are around. If you don't have a concept of, for example, abstract labor, or the right concept of value, you don't have a concept of exploitation, and then you don't have a concept of the working class. So what would be, I mean, or do you say it's already written in the Bible and the working class is there? Or would you say that the role of theory, or Gesellschaftstheorie, as it's called, is still, I don't know, a question mark that has to be solved? So.
Okay, yeah, the question that I want to ask is sort of dumb, actually, but I'm still going to ask it, because everything that you're saying is like, I find it very enlightening, but it's sort of depressing, and I'm referring to the very end of your book, so I'm wondering, is there any hope for...
I thought I already made some hopeful statements.
No, you didn't.
No?
You go ahead.
No, I mean, I made the point, first of all, about the desire for social purpose, right? And the desire to be linked into something. And the problem is that we're waiting for some authority, some daddy to tell us what we're going to do. But even daddy isn't daddy anymore, effectively. So that is something that confronts us. And, you know, to extend this metaphor far beyond its use, we should all become daddy collectively. Don't quote me on that, it's terrible. So I think, you know, that's one positive element. The other, where we concluded the book, because you make reference to this, is this discourse of essential workers. I mean, I don't know if this was so present in Germany yet, that might have turned some attention, and it seemed to briefly, to what actually makes the economy run, to logistics workers, health workers, people who work in supermarkets, whatever, all the basic things that make society function, and not all the bureaucrats and financiers and the rest. That seemed to briefly bear some fruit when you had a tighter labor market, especially in the US, and you saw people quitting their jobs, which were terribly paid, very kind of oppressive, too fast paced, etc., especially working in kitchens, and decided to go do something else. That seems to have evaporated a little bit, and all that talk of the Great Resignation, I think, has died down somewhat. So I don't know if that's still something to be hopeful for. That was us trying to be hopeful at the end of the book. I think it remains to be seen, because I don't think there was a possibility for the subject to be created of the essential worker that could then be filled, which then would require maybe some theorization of what that actually means. Not to dispense with Marxist theory, but in some way theory has to chase reality, not the other way around. And so that might have been some moment. Maybe it's past, I don't know. I think we'll still have to wait and see. I'm trying to do something positive, but that doesn't sound like happy clappy. But I think we'll have to leave that there.
Yeah, I'll just conclude that I think at least you all, as good Marxists, would agree that there's an essential role that comes to theory, and that maybe there's a question, maybe we should be doing the right type of theory to see that as a metaphysical entity, the working class is not simply out there. So you need a specific scientific approach to actually discover why Marx discovered this agent of negativity in something like the working class, which is very tightly tied to a specific analysis of capitalist society, which means that, at least intellectually, that imposes a task on us where, what does it mean to start thinking about the subject that is out there or that could be out there? But that is in many ways like a theoretical task that can't just be done through like spontaneous invocations of a sort of revolutionary eruption that won't come out of nothing. And then the question about the hopefulness, I think there's this beautiful saying by Max Horkheimer who said, I think to Adorno, where like, I don't think things will turn out well, but the idea that they might is very important. And I think this is the approach that many of you take in the book as well, where this is...
Yeah, no, and I think just to add one final thing to that, as well, is that I think this is, for all that the world seems increasingly chaotic and politics now seems configured by a conflict between different forms of emergency politics on left and right. Everybody has their own form of emergency politics as a way to try to break through the impasse, but I think it actually tends to perpetuate the impasse rather than get past it. So, to return to theory, I think this might actually be a good moment to think. It's a point that Slavoj Žižek always makes, but I think it's right that rather than chasing the next electoral cycle, trying to find a way to make a little bit of a difference, this would be a good moment to stop and reflect. And I think it's important to remember, don't panic. Things are much worse than you think they are.
All right, I'd say if there are more questions, we can do it in a more casual setting with drinks.